How to write a thesis statement. While the hook or opening sentence of the essay is important because it sets the tone for the rest of the paper, the thesis statement is perhaps the most important sentence of the entire essay because it establishes the goal and framework for the paper. But what is a thesis statement? A thesis statement is a sentence that explains the position you are setting out to prove in your essay. In short, it is your argument. But why is it important? Well, there's two reasons. First, it gives you a clear direction and purpose for your paper. Every paragraph that you write will be aiming to prove the thesis statement. In addition, it makes it easy for your reader to assess and understand your work. What happens if your thesis is unclear? Well, even if you do really great research, and even if you have really great analysis, if you haven't set out the framework for a clear argument at the outset of your paper, the person marking your paper may not know what you are trying to prove, and therefore they don't know how to evaluate the merits of the evidence and analysis you provided. That can be bad for your grade. And you don't want to have to go back to your GA or instructor and then plead your case as to what exactly you were trying to prove in order to get the mark you know you deserve. Given the importance of the thesis statement, it's critical to understand how to write an effective thesis. To this end, there are 7 components. First, who? Who are the parties or people related to your argument? What is the subject or phenomena that you are discussing? What is your argument or position? Where? Are there any relevant locations? When? Is there a time or context that frames your argument? How? What is your method of analysis? How do you intend to prove your argument? And why? What is the purpose of your argument? What are the merits of proving your argument? Though there are 7 components that you should consider when constructing a thesis statement, there are a couple of additional notes to keep in mind. First, not every thesis will have all 7 components. Ideally, you should identify the components that apply to your essay and use them only. Don't force all 7 components in if they're not suited or related to your argument. That process can be difficult, so let's take a look at each of the 7 components and identify what factors you should consider when constructing your thesis statement. Who? When we're looking at the who component of the thesis, there are a number of things to consider. Are there authors involved, such as Virginia Woolf or William Shakespeare? Are there academic figures, such as Sigmund Freud or Albert Einstein? Are there historical figures, such as Frederick Douglass or Gandhi? Are there characters, such as Ash Ketchum or Nick Fury? Or are there participants or target populations, such as students? Not all papers have a who component, particularly in the STEM fields. If there aren't people related to your specific argument, don't feel like you have to include this component, but do give it careful consideration. What is your subject? When we're considering the what component of the thesis, this refers to the specific phenomenon or phenomena you are discussing. In technology fields, it could be something like computers or computer science, or renewable energy such as solar panels. In philosophy, you might be looking at specific philosophers such as Plato or Lao Tzu. In psychology or medical fields, you might be looking at disorders or diseases such as the COVID-19 virus or depression. You might be considering an event like the tragic events of September 11th, or you could be looking at a work of art such as Van Gogh's Starry Nights. Again, not every essay has a what component. Give it careful consideration and determine whether or not this relates to your paper. If it doesn't, don't feel compelled to include it. What is your argument? This refers to the position you are taking on the issue or the conclusion that you are forwarding to your reader. Unlike some of the other components, this element is required. You must have an argument in your essay because this is what you're working to prove throughout the rest of the paper. Where. The where component of the thesis refers to any locations that are relevant to your argument. This could include geographic locations, such as Paris or Egypt. It could include institutions, such as schools or factories. It can also include physical spaces, such as the human body, and even conceptual spaces, such as discourses surrounding law or philosophy. Where is one of the components that is most likely to be left off of the thesis. It's therefore important to consider in which contexts we might not include where. Many essays are not associated with specific physical locations. For example, in math and engineering, it's unlikely that we'll have a specific location associated with the argument. In biology and chemistry, we likely won't have a space either outside of the human body. In computer science, in philosophy, and in human kinetics. In each of these disciplines, it's unlikely that there will be a where, although it is important to give it careful consideration and ensure you include it if it does apply. When. The when component of the thesis statement refers to any temporal elements associated with the topics or contexts that need to be clarified. Most papers are written about current issues. Therefore, in this context, simply writing in present tense is sufficient for fulfilling the when component of the thesis. However, there are instances where you need to provide a little more detail about the when. Let's take a look at some of those. When is typically required in history papers. For example, you might be writing about the Qing dynasty, in which case you could begin with during the Qing dynasty, ... and then go into the rest of your thesis. If you're writing a paper about the Tuskegee Airmen, you might begin with in World War II or during World War II, and then go into the substance of your paper. Likewise, if you're writing about the construction of the Taj Mahal, you might begin with during the Mughal Empire, and then go on to complete the thesis statement. When is also used in narrative contexts, particularly when a phenomenon is introduced to a new context or environment, and the student is expected to argue as to the merits or demerits of this new approach. For example, in education, student-centered approaches may have replaced teacher-student-centered approaches. In this context, you might begin with, when using student-centered approaches, ... and then you would go into whether or not this approach is more or less advantageous than the teacher-centered approaches. In psychology, you might be warning the reader about the potential side effects of a pharmacological approach. In this context, you could begin with, when using pharmacological approaches, ... and then highlight your specific concerns. And likewise, in technology, you might be comparing and contrasting two modes of energy. When gas heating is replaced with solar panels, ... and then you might express which one is more advantageous than the other. Again, most papers are written about current issues. Therefore, using present tense is sufficient for covering the when component of the thesis. Be sure to consider whether or not your paper needs something a little more specific. How. The how component of the thesis refers to the methodological approach you will use to prove your position. There are a number of approaches that could be used. Among the most common, for example, is a comparison. You might be comparing apples and oranges. You might likewise be doing an analysis of the material that you looked at. Whichever approach you do use, keep in mind that this component is required. While many of the other elements of the thesis are not required, it is critical that you explain to your reader how you plan on proving your argument. Why? The why component of your essay explains the purpose, reason, or benefits for proving your argument. For example, if you're a business major pushing an argument onto a company and suggesting they should adopt a given approach, you might be arguing that it would increase profits. Likewise, if you're in education and you're advocating for including student-centered approaches, you might argue that it has the potential to enhance or improve learning outcomes. And if you're in a helping profession, such as social work, psychology, or medicine, you might argue that you can help improve patient outcomes. Whatever the reason is, it is critical that you include the why. Why is your argument beneficial? Why is it advantageous? Or what does it contribute to the field? There is a note to consider with respect to the why component of the thesis. Sometimes the why is self-evident and does not need to be expressly stated. This is particularly true when instructors have given you a specific assignment as an exercise. There might not be an outward value to you conducting a specific analysis. Its only purpose is to show your instructor whether or not you comprehend the subject or whether or not you're capable of fulfilling that analysis. In this case, you might not need to express the why. So let's quickly recap the 7 components. We have the who are the people related to your argument, the what are the subjects or phenomena related to your argument, the second what is your argument or position, where, are there any geographical locations relevant to your argument, when, is there a temporal context or time relevant to your argument, how, what is the method of analysis, and why, what is the benefit or purpose of proving your argument. Now we know the 7 components, but how do we put them into practice to formulate an effective thesis? Well, let's assume that you're a human kinetics major, and you've been tasked with writing a paper on whether or not the NCAA should pay its athletes. The first thing we want to do is create the checklist, and then fill out each of these 7 components to determine which are relevant. So, the first thing we want to look at is the who. In this case, it would be the collegiate athletes. What is our subject? The NCAA's policy on paying college athletes. What is our argument? In this case, let's assume our argument is that collegiate athletes should be paid. Where? Is there a relevant location? Within the field of college athletics or in the NCAA. When? Now, we're talking in the present or about a current issue, so using present tense should suffice. How? We might do an analysis of the NCAA's policy. And why? So that we can make the NCAA both more ethical and more competitive. Now that we've got all 7 components, how do we begin the sentence? I usually recommend that students begin with the how, an analysis, and then go on to what you're going to analyze. An analysis of what? The NCAA's policy. So we'll place that next. Now we're going to go on to explain what this analysis explains. And in this case, we're going to be using a verb in present tense. So that way we'll cover the when. An analysis of the NCAA's policy on paying students suggests that. And what shall we put next? College athletes are who. Then follow that with our argument, should be paid. What's next? The NCAA, to make college athletics more ethical and competitive. Now we've got all the components. We begin with an analysis of our how. The NCAA's policy, our what, suggests that is in present tense, that covers our when. That college athletes are who, should be paid, that is our position, where, in college athletics, and why, to make it more ethical and competitive. What about other contexts? Perhaps you're an education major, and you've been tasked with writing a comparison essay that incorporates teacher-centered approaches and student-centered approaches. Well, let's identify the 7 components. In this case, our who might simply refer to the students. What is our subject? Teacher and student-centered learning approaches. What is our argument? Let's assume that we're going to argue the two approaches should be combined. Where? In the classroom. When? Again, this is a current issue, so using present tense should suffice. How? We'll do a comparison. And why? Because we want to improve academic outcomes. Now we've got all 7 components. Again, we'll begin with the how, a comparison. A comparison of what? The teacher and student-centered pedagogies. So we'll bring those over. We're going to go into a verb now that we'll place in present tense, and that will articulate that it's a current issue and fulfill the when component of the thesis. A comparison of teacher and student-centered pedagogies demonstrates that now we might put our position. Combining them can, what is the benefit? Improve academic outcomes. Of who? Whose academic outcomes? The students. And where is this happening? In the classroom. Now we've got all the components. A comparison of teacher and student-centered pedagogies demonstrates that combining them can improve the academic outcomes of students in the classroom. Other contexts? Perhaps you're in nursing and you've been tasked with writing a paper about various nursing interventions. Let's take a look at how we might construct that thesis. Our who? Nurses and patients in this context. What's our subject? Nursing interventions. What is our argument? Perhaps you've chosen patient-centered approaches as a critical nursing intervention. Where? In a hospital or clinical setting. When? Again, we're talking about a current issue, so we can use present tense. How? By doing a critical evaluation of the interventions. And why? So that we can improve patient outcomes. We've got all 7 components, so let's begin our sentence. A critical evaluation would be the how. But what are we doing a critical evaluation of? Nursing interventions, of course. And we go back to our verb, which we place in present tense. A critical evaluation of various nursing interventions illustrates that we're going to advocate for patient-centered care. Patient-centered care is critical too, but what is it critical to? Helping nurses are who improve outcomes. And where are they going to be improving these outcomes? In hospital and clinical settings. There are different ways that you could have ordered this, but as it stands, we have a critical evaluation of various nursing interventions illustrates that patient-centered care is critical to helping nurses improve patient outcomes in clinical and hospital settings. Note, you don't have to start your thesis with the how. I recommend this approach because it makes the rest of the thesis easy to structure. However, use the order or sequence that makes the most sense for your thesis. For example, a number of students like to start with the why because it shows the importance of their argument. Let's take a look at the last thesis we constructed and reorder it to see if the why can be an effective approach in that context. We have the same 7 components, but instead of starting with the how, we can start with the why. To improve patient outcomes. But where are we doing this? In hospital and clinical settings. Who's going to be improving them? The nurses, of course. To improve patient outcomes in the hospital and clinical settings, nurses should employ our present tense, but what should they employ? This is going to be our argument. Patient-centered care. What do we have left? Our critical evaluation, as demonstrated by a critical evaluation of what are nursing interventions. So, to improve patient outcomes in hospital and clinical settings, nurses should employ patient-centered care as demonstrated by a critical evaluation of nursing interventions. Though the structure is different, this thesis is equally effective. So let's recap the process. First, we create a checklist with the 7 components. Then, we add our argument's relevant components. Then create a sentence with these elements. Keep in mind, you must verify that you have 3 key components: a clear argument, what is your position? A mode of analysis, how are you going to prove it? And finally, the purpose. Why is this thesis or argument beneficial? Now you know the basic components of the thesis, but before you begin writing, consider these final thoughts. First, keep in mind that not every thesis has all 7 components. These are a guideline. If there are any elements that don't seem applicable to your argument, don't feel like you have to include them. Second, though it's often easiest to begin with the how, use the sequence that makes the most sense for your argument. This is an organic process. Don't feel like you have to fit a specific or rigid blueprint. And finally, if your teacher has given you a more specific instruction, follow their model. Oftentimes, in disciplines such as nursing or philosophy, instructors will give students a specific outline. Make sure you follow their outline because they're the ones that are going to be marking your paper and you want to conform to their expectations. Now that you've got all these pieces, you're ready to go and write your own thesis. If you're struggling at all during the writing process with your thesis or any other component, don't hesitate to consult with the Writing Support Desk. Book an appointment through My Success and we'll be happy to give you some one-on-one help. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.